At just 17, Jacob Brooks stood in court, facing laughter and condescension. Judge Lowe dismissed him, saying, "Leave the law to the professionals." The corporate attorneys smirked, confident of victory. But Jacob had uncovered a hidden truth, one that would expose corruption and change everything. What happened next left the entire courtroom stunned. But let's start from the beginning. 17-year-old Jacob Brooks took a deep breath as he adjusted the lapels of his ill-fitted suit. The courtroom loomed before him, grand and imposing, its dark wood paneling and high ceilings amplifying the pressure he already felt. This wasn't a school debate or a mock trial in a classroom. This was a real courtroom, with a real case and real stakes. For Jacob, it was the chance to prove that age and experience didn't define competence or his ability to seek justice. But the moment he stepped inside, it became clear he wasn't just facing a legal challenge. He was facing a room filled with skepticism and scorn. The two corporate lawyers representing the opposing side, both seasoned professionals in their polished designer suits, exchanged smirks as they caught sight of Jacob. One of them, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, leaned over to his colleague and muttered something that made her chuckle quietly. Jacob knew they were laughing at him, at his youth, at his presence, at the audacity of a teenager daring to step into their world. Judge Henry Lowe sat behind the bench, his presence dominating the room. A man in his 60s with a reputation for being stern and unforgiving, Lowe had a no-nonsense demeanor that was reflected in his sharp glares and curt tone. His gaze fell on Jacob as the young man approached the plaintiff's table. Lowe's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. The disdain was clear in his eyes, the slight lift of his eyebrow conveying everything he thought. What is this child doing in my courtroom? The courtroom audience wasn't much better. A mixture of observers, reporters, and community members had gathered, some out of curiosity and others simply to pass judgment. Whispers filled the room as Jacob walked to his seat, his steps steady despite the murmurs. "Is that really him?" a woman whispered from the back row. "He looks like he borrowed that suit from his dad," a man replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "This should be interesting," someone else added, with just enough sarcasm to draw a few quiet chuckles. Jacob felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, each murmur and sideways glance a reminder that no one here thought he belonged. His suit was, in fact, a size too big, borrowed from his uncle just days before. The sleeves were slightly long and the shoulders didn't fit quite right. To the crowd, it made him look like a kid playing dress-up. But Jacob had bigger concerns than his appearance. He wasn't here to impress them with his clothes. He was here to win. He laid out his papers methodically, his hands steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. The case wasn't simple. It involved a dispute between a local farmer and a major corporation over land rights. The corporation's attorneys had resources, connections, and experience. Jacob had only his preparation and determination. As the court proceedings began, Judge Lowe wasted no time making his skepticism known. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of authority, "I trust you understand the gravity of participating in this courtroom. This is not an exercise or a high school debate. Real people's livelihoods are at stake here." "Yes, Your Honor," Jacob replied, his voice steady but polite. He stood straight, meeting the judge's gaze. "I understand the responsibility, and I'm prepared." Lowe gave a short, humorless laugh. "Prepared," he repeated, almost to himself. The slight shake of his head made it clear he doubted that claim. The first few exchanges of the day set the tone. The corporate attorneys spoke with confidence, their arguments crisp and rehearsed. They used legal jargon as if it were second nature, weaving it seamlessly into their presentations. Jacob listened intently, scribbling notes as they laid out their opening statements. When it was his turn to speak, Jacob rose and took a moment to gather his thoughts. The room grew quiet, expectant. The opposing lawyers didn't bother to hide their smirks. Judge Lowe leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of boredom and mild irritation, as if waiting for Jacob to stumble. "Your Honor," Jacob began, his voice clear but calm. "Members of the court, the heart of this case is about fairness, about ensuring that every person, regardless of their status or resources, is treated equally under the law." A few heads in the audience turned, their expressions shifting from amusement to faint curiosity. The words were simple, but Jacob delivered them with conviction, his tone steady and unyielding. Yet, as he delved into the specifics of his argument, the interruptions began. Judge Lowe cut him off twice, questioning his phrasing. The corporate attorneys objected to minor details, forcing Jacob to pause and rephrase. Each time, Jacob maintained his composure, adjusting his approach without showing frustration. But it was clear to everyone in the room that the deck was stacked against him. The tension was palpable by midday. Jacob could feel the quiet disbelief around him, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Why is he still trying? But Jacob wasn't one to quit. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying case law, memorizing precedents, and even practicing arguments in front of his skeptical older sister. Every piece of criticism, every dismissive comment had only fueled his resolve. He knew he had an uphill battle, but he also knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the farmer who had trusted him, for the principle of fairness, and for the belief that even the underestimated could make a difference. Jacob glanced at the opposing table, where the corporate attorneys exchanged confident glances, certain they had already won. He caught Judge Lowe's eye for a brief moment, the older man's expression unchanged. And yet, Jacob held his head high. They didn't believe in him now, but that didn't matter. He would make them believe. What Jacob didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a day no one in that courtroom would ever forget. Jacob Brooks rose from his seat as the courtroom settled into a tense silence. The opposing attorneys had delivered their arguments with precision, using their polished voices and practiced rhetoric to command the room. Now, it was his turn. All eyes fell on the teenager as he adjusted his slightly oversized suit jacket and made his way to the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his notes, though he hoped no one would notice. "Your Honor," Jacob began, his voice steady but quieter than he intended. He glanced at Judge Henry Lowe, whose impassive expression was framed by the imposing bench. "I'd like to present my argument on behalf of my client, Mr. Harris." But just a few sentences into his statement, Jacob stumbled. A misquoted date, an incorrectly referenced statute. Small mistakes, perhaps, but in a room full of seasoned professionals, they were magnified. The lead attorney for the corporation, James Warren, seized the moment. "Objection, Your Honor," Warren said smoothly, rising to his feet. "The counsel is citing an outdated precedent." Judge Lowe raised an eyebrow and turned his gaze to Jacob. "Mr. Brooks, is that true? Are you quoting irrelevant case law?" The tone of his voice dripped with sarcasm, each word crafted to make the young attorney feel smaller. Jacob fumbled through his papers, his cheeks burning as he tried to find the correct reference. I apologize, Your Honor," he stammered. "Let me rephrase." The judge exhaled audibly, leaning back in his chair. "Take your time, Mr. Brooks," he said, his tone flat but carrying an edge of impatience. "We have all day, after all." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Jacob felt the weight of the ridicule pressing down on him, the unspoken judgment from the audience almost tangible. He cleared his throat, trying to push past the embarrassment, and continued. He barely made it 2 more sentences before another interruption. This time it was Warren's partner, Emily Carver, who rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth and authoritative. "The counsel's argument lacks clarity and fails to address the key issue of this case. I request that he clarify his point." Judge Lowe nodded. "A fair point, Ms. Carver." Mr. Brooks, perhaps you could enlighten us on what exactly you're trying to argue here. The word struck like a blow. Jacob's carefully prepared arguments, rehearsed in front of a mirror for hours, now felt like a crumbling tower of mismatched blocks. He swallowed hard, gripping the podium as he tried to regroup. "The issue, Your Honor," Jacob began again, forcing his voice to steady, "is whether the corporation acted within the boundaries of property law when they seized the Harris family's land without prior notification." "Objection," Warren interrupted with a smirk. "The counsel is oversimplifying a complex contractual agreement. It's clear he doesn't fully understand the terms of the sale." Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Lowe cut him off. "Sustained," the judge said, his tone growing colder. "Mr. Brooks, I suggest you stick to the facts of the case rather than making sweeping generalizations." The humiliation was suffocating. Jacob's vision blurred slightly, and for a fleeting moment he considered stepping back, apologizing and giving up. But the thought of Mr. Harris, his client, a man who had trusted him despite the odds, kept him rooted in place. The courtroom grew heavier with tension as Jacob pressed on. His sentences grew halting, his rhythm broken by the constant interruptions and objections. The opposing attorneys seemed to take turns picking apart his arguments, each correction delivered with thinly veiled derision. The audience whispered among themselves, the skepticism and pity in their voices cutting deeper than the judge's remarks. "Poor kid doesn't stand a chance," someone murmured from the back row. "Why did they even let him in here?" another whispered. Jacob heard it all, even as he kept his eyes on his notes. His hands trembled as he turned a page, and he felt a knot tightening in his chest. But he refused to let the tears welling in his eyes fall. Not here. Not now. And yet, not everyone in the audience shared the same scorn. Near the back, a middle-aged woman frowned as she watched the spectacle unfold. Her eyes softened as she saw Jacob's resolve, his refusal to crumble entirely under the relentless onslaught. A younger man next to her, dressed in casual clothes, shook his head. "The kid's got guts," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "He does," the woman replied quietly, her expression thoughtful. As Jacob stumbled through the final portion of his argument, the weight of the courtroom seemed to press harder against him. His voice cracked once, just briefly, as he tried to explain a critical piece of evidence. Warren leaned back in his chair, looking as though he were already celebrating a victory. Carver tapped her pen against the table, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Finally, Jacob paused, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. He looked up at Judge Lowe, his face pale but his eyes steady. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firmer than before, "despite my mistakes, I ask that the court consider the fundamental question of fairness in this case. My client deserves the chance to have his story heard." For the first time, the room fell silent. There was no laughter, no whispering. Judge Lowe said nothing, his expression unreadable. The opposing attorneys exchanged a glance, their smirks faltering for a moment. Jacob sat down, his hands shaking as he gathered his papers. The first round was over, and he knew he hadn't done well, but he had made it through. He had refused to break. And though many still doubted him, a few in the audience began to see something more in the young attorney, something they hadn't expected. Determination, resilience, a quiet strength that refused to be silenced. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The second day of the trial began with an air of routine confidence from the opposing side. The corporate lawyers, James Warren and Emily Carver, strolled into the courtroom with their usual composed demeanor, their smiles smug, their briefcases meticulously organized. Judge Henry Lowe entered soon after, his expression as stoic as ever, though his eyes briefly scanned the room to settle on Jacob Brooks. If the judge had hoped the young attorney would abandon his case after yesterday's rough session, he was about to be disappointed. Jacob entered the courtroom quietly, his oversized suit still slightly askew, but his posture was different, more upright, more determined. He carried his case file with a sense of purpose, and though the whispers from the audience continued, there was less laughter. A few spectators who had dismissed him as a fluke on the first day now watched with curiosity. After all, he had returned. When the court was called to order, Jacob wasted no time. He stood, addressing Judge Lowe with a firm voice that carried across the room. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a new piece of evidence for the court's review." James Warren immediately rose, already prepared to object. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The evidence should have been disclosed during pretrial discovery. We request this submission be denied." Judge Lowe turned his skeptical gaze toward Jacob, his tone laced with impatience. "Mr. Brooks, you are aware of the rules of procedure, aren't you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jacob replied, his voice steady but respectful. "This document was only uncovered late last night as I reviewed the case history again. It directly relates to the actions of the defendant and is crucial to demonstrating my client's position." Warren crossed his arms, visibly annoyed. "This is a blatant attempt to derail the proceedings. It's nothing more than a last-minute stunt." But Jacob wasn't rattled. "Your Honor, the document is a land usage report from 3 years ago, issued by the same corporation that claims ownership of my client's property. It explicitly states that the land in question was considered protected farmland under federal guidelines, which would make their seizure unlawful." The courtroom fell into a brief, stunned silence. Even the audience, many of whom had come expecting another day of watching Jacob struggle, leaned forward. Jacob held the document high, his hand steady despite the tension in the room. Judge Lowe, however, wasn't so easily impressed. He waved a dismissive hand. "You're telling me you just happened to find this last night? That seems highly convenient." "It's not convenient, Your Honor," Jacob countered. "It's the result of hours of combing through public records that the defense conveniently chose not to highlight. I believe this oversight was intentional." Emily Carver's expression tightened, and she leaned over to whisper something to Warren. For the first time, their confidence wavered. The mention of protected farmland was a significant complication, one they clearly hadn't anticipated. "Your Honor," Warren interjected, recovering quickly. "Even if this document is authentic, it's irrelevant. The plaintiff's claims hinge on contractual agreements, not land classification." Jacob took a step forward, his voice rising slightly, though it remained controlled. "On the contrary, Your Honor, it's entirely relevant. If the land is federally protected, no private contract can override that status. The seizure would be illegal, rendering the defense's entire case void." Judge Lowe tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for silence. "Enough. Let me see the document." Jacob handed the report to the court clerk, who brought it to the judge. As Lowe scanned the pages, his brow furrowed. It was clear he recognized the significance of what he was reading, but his expression remained unreadable. "Your Honor," Carver said, seizing the opportunity, "this document could easily be misinterpreted. I move that it be excluded until its authenticity can be verified." Jacob anticipated this and responded immediately. "Your Honor, the document comes directly from the Department of Agriculture's publicly accessible archives. I have the verification logs to prove its authenticity, and I'm prepared to present them." The audience murmured again. Several people exchanged glances, and a few nodded, as if impressed by Jacob's preparation. For the first time, his confidence felt tangible, even contagious. But Judge Lowe wasn't about to let the young attorney gain too much momentum. "Mr. Brooks," he said sharply, setting the document aside, "while this evidence is compelling, I find your implication that the defense intentionally withheld it to be baseless and inflammatory. I advise you to tread carefully." Jacob stood firm, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. "My intent, Your Honor, is not to inflame, but to ensure that justice is served. My client deserves a fair hearing, and this evidence is central to achieving that." The tension in the room was palpable now. Even Warren and Carver, who had spent much of the first day belittling Jacob, seemed to be re-evaluating their strategy. Carver scribbled furiously in her notes, while Warren's jaw tightened. Judge Lowe finally leaned back, his gavel poised but still. "Very well," he said with visible reluctance. "The document will be admitted into evidence, but I expect both parties to address its relevance thoroughly in their next arguments." Jacob exhaled quietly, his face calm, but his chest swelling with a small sense of victory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the fight alive. As the proceedings continued, the corporate attorneys worked hard to downplay the significance of the evidence. They twisted its context, challenged its relevance, and leaned heavily on procedural technicalities, but the cracks in their confidence were beginning to show. Meanwhile, the audience, once indifferent or even mocking, had begun to shift. Some whispered about the judge's hostility toward Jacob, while others murmured about the audacity of the corporate lawyer's tactics. A growing sense of injustice filled the room, and it became clear to many that this wasn't just about a case. It was about a young man standing up against a system stacked against him. Jacob remained composed, even as Judge Lowe interrupted him multiple times with dismissive remarks. He didn't flinch, didn't falter. His voice carried the same steady determination it had that morning, and though he still faced an uphill battle, his resolve was unmistakable. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. Jacob Brooks was no longer just a teenager fumbling his way through a trial. He was a young attorney who, despite the odds, was starting to command the attention and the respect of the courtroom. The tension in the courtroom had been building for days, but no one expected what was about to unfold. Jacob Brooks, the 17-year-old underdog who had endured relentless interruptions and dismissive comments, stood with an air of quiet determination that commanded attention. He had spent the previous night combing through court records, obscure filings, and legal databases, chasing a hunch that refused to let him rest. Now, he was ready. "Your Honor," Jacob began, his voice steady and clear. "Before proceeding further, I must raise a matter of critical importance to this case." He paused for effect, his gaze sweeping the room. Every eye was on him now, the audience leaning forward in anticipation. Judge Henry Lowe frowned, visibly irritated. "Mr. Brooks, if this is another diversion, I suggest you reconsider. The court's time is not a playground for baseless speculation." Jacob didn't flinch. "It's not speculation, Your Honor," he replied, his tone sharp but respectful. "It's about ensuring the integrity of these proceedings. I have reason to believe there is a conflict of interest involving the bench." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The corporate attorneys, James Warren and Emily Carver, stiffened in their seats, exchanging quick, uneasy glances. The audience murmured, their curiosity piqued by Jacob's boldness. Judge Lowe's expression darkened. "Careful, Mr. Brooks. Accusations of this nature are serious." "I understand that, Your Honor," Jacob said, his confidence unshaken. "But so is justice. If the court will permit, I'd like to present my findings." The judge hesitated, then gestured reluctantly. "Proceed." Jacob stepped forward, holding a neatly organized folder. "In the course of reviewing past rulings and corporate disclosures related to this case, I discovered something troubling. Specifically, Your Honor, your connection to the defendant's parent corporation, Clearview Holdings." A gasp echoed through the courtroom. Warren immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. The plaintiff's counsel is clearly attempting to undermine the court's authority." Judge Lowe's gavel struck sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Warren. I'll hear this out." His voice was tight, his composure beginning to crack. Jacob continued, his voice unwavering. Clearview Holdings, through its subsidiary, Greenfield Development, has a documented history of cases presided over by Your Honor. In reviewing those cases, I noticed a pattern, a disproportionate number of rulings favoring Clearview, many of which were overturned on appeal. He paused to let the weight of his words settle. The courtroom was utterly silent, save for the faint rustle of papers as Warren flipped through his notes, visibly rattled. That's not all, Jacob added, his tone growing sharper. Further research revealed that Clearview Holdings is a major donor to the Civic Foundation chaired by Your Honor's brother, Charles Lowe. Over the past 5 years, Clearview has contributed over $250,000 to that foundation. Judge Lowe's face flushed. That's irrelevant, he snapped, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. With respect, Your Honor, it's far from irrelevant, Jacob countered. Under the Code of Judicial Conduct, any financial or personal connection that could reasonably be perceived as a conflict of interest requires disclosure and, if necessary, recusal. To my knowledge, no such disclosure was made. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but Jacob pressed on. Your Honor, this isn't about questioning your integrity. It's about ensuring that my client, and every litigant, receives a fair trial. To proceed without addressing this issue would compromise the very foundation of justice. For a moment, no one spoke. The seasoned attorneys, who had treated Jacob with condescension just days earlier, now sat rigidly in their chairs, their expressions a mixture of shock and unease. Even the audience, which had initially pitied the young lawyer, now looked at him with something close to awe. Judge Lowe's gavel struck again, harder this time, as he tried to regain control of the room. Do you have proof of these allegations, Mr. Brooks? Jacob nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I've submitted the relevant financial records, case history summaries, and excerpts from the Judicial Code for the court's review. He gestured to the court clerk, who retrieved the documents and handed them to the bench. As Judge Lowe skimmed through the evidence, his jaw tightened. The color drained from his face as the implications became undeniable. The once unflappable figure who had dominated the courtroom now looked cornered, exposed. Your Honor, Jacob said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. In light of this evidence, I am formally filing a motion to have you recuse yourself from this case. The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. The audience collectively held its breath. Even Warren, for all his bravado, had no immediate objection to offer. Carver sat stone-faced, her pen frozen mid-note. Judge Lowe set the papers down slowly, his hands trembling ever so slightly. His eyes flicked toward Jacob, and for the first time, they held no trace of the contempt that had marked every interaction. Instead, there was a flicker of something else. Perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps resentment. I will review this motion, Lowe said finally, his voice subdued. But for now, this court is adjourned. He struck his gavel with a finality that echoed through the room, then rose and exited through the judge's chambers without another word. His departure was abrupt, almost desperate, leaving the courtroom buzzing with whispers. Jacob exhaled deeply as he returned to his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He had just taken the greatest risk of his young career, challenging not only the defense but the very authority of the bench, and he had done it with precision, professionalism, and an unshakable commitment to justice. The audience's perception of Jacob had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer just a teenager in an ill-fitting suit, fumbling through legal arguments. He was a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of resilience and integrity. And though the trial was far from over, one thing was clear. Jacob Brooks had already made his mark. As the courtroom emptied, the murmurs grew louder, the words brilliant, courageous, and unexpected floating through the air. Even the most skeptical observers couldn't help but admire what they had just witnessed. The courtroom had a different atmosphere on the final day of the trial. Judge Lowe's absence was palpable, a stark reminder of the events that had shaken the room just days earlier. In his place sat Judge Miriam Caldwell, a respected and impartial figure known for her fairness and sharp legal mind. The change in the room's dynamics was immediate. The air of tension that had previously hung heavy now felt charged with anticipation, as though everyone present knew they were witnessing the conclusion of something extraordinary. Jacob Brooks, seated at the plaintiff's table, looked calmer than he had on previous days. Though his suit was still slightly oversized, his demeanor had shifted. He no longer appeared as the nervous teenager battling a storm of skepticism. Instead, he exuded quiet confidence, the kind that came from knowing he had fought hard and was now on the verge of victory. Across the aisle, the corporate attorneys, James Warren and Emily Carver, looked less assured. Gone were the smirks and air of invincibility that had marked their earlier appearances. Their whispered conversations were tense, their eyes flickering toward the judge's bench as though searching for reassurance that would not come. They knew the tide had turned. As the proceedings began, Judge Caldwell's no-nonsense demeanor set the tone. She addressed both sides with equal gravity, making it clear that theatrics would have no place in her courtroom. "This case has garnered significant attention," she said, her voice firm but fair. "But at its core, it remains a question of justice, and I intend to see it resolved as such." Jacob rose to deliver his closing argument. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. Gone were the stumbles and hesitations of his earlier days in court. He spoke with clarity and conviction, his voice carrying the weight of the evidence he had meticulously presented. "At its heart, this case is about more than property rights," Jacob said, his eyes sweeping the room. "It's about fairness. It's about standing up to those who believe they can bend the law to their will simply because they have the resources to do so. My client, Mr. Harris, is a farmer who has worked his land for decades. That land is his livelihood, his legacy, and his home. It is not something that can be taken from him through underhanded tactics and disregard for the law." Warren attempted to interject, but Judge Caldwell silenced him with a single raised hand. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Warren," she said firmly, turning her attention back to Jacob. "Continue, Mr. Brooks." Jacob nodded, gratitude flashing briefly across his face before he pressed on. "The evidence is clear. The corporation acted unlawfully when they seized Mr. Harris's property, ignoring federal protections and manipulating contracts to suit their agenda. But justice cannot, and will not, be bought." When he finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then Judge Caldwell nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Defense counsel, you may proceed." Warren and Carver took their turn, but their arguments lacked the force they'd had earlier in the trial. The evidence against them was too strong, and the new judge's impartiality left no room for the dismissive tactics they had previously employed. By the time they finished, it was clear to everyone in the room that the corporation's case had crumbled. Before Judge Caldwell could issue her ruling, Warren stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice tight, "the defense would like to propose a settlement." The audience erupted in murmurs, but Caldwell silenced them with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Proceed, Mr. Warren." Warren exchanged a brief glance with Carver before continuing. "After consulting with my client, we are prepared to offer a settlement in favor of the plaintiff. The Harris family will retain full ownership of their property, and my client will cover all legal fees incurred during this process." The murmurs returned, louder this time, as spectators processed the unexpected concession. Jacob's client, Mr. Harris, looked at the young attorney with tears in his eyes, his gratitude evident. Jacob placed a steadying hand on the man's shoulder, his expression calm but resolute. Judge Caldwell nodded approvingly. "Mr. Harris, do you accept this settlement?" "Yes, Your Honor." The farmer replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I do." "Then it is so ordered," Caldwell declared, striking her gavel. "The case is resolved in favor of the plaintiff." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, as the reality of what had just happened sank in, the courtroom erupted into applause. Spectators stood, clapping and cheering, their earlier skepticism of Jacob replaced with admiration. Even some of the courtroom staff, who had maintained professional neutrality throughout the trial, exchanged small smiles. Jacob allowed himself a deep breath, and, finally, a small smile. He had done it. He had not only won the case, but also proved himself in a courtroom where no one had believed he belonged. He glanced at Mr. Harris, whose relief and gratitude were written plainly across his face, and knew that this victory wasn't just his, it was theirs. As the applause died down, Jacob began to gather his papers, his hands steady despite the emotional whirlwind. Warren and Carver, now subdued, approached him. Warren extended a hand. "Good work, Brooks," he said, his tone begrudging but respectful. "You've got a future in this field." Jacob hesitated for only a moment before shaking the man's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. It wasn't an admission of forgiveness for their earlier tactics, but it was acknowledgement enough. As the courtroom emptied, spectators lingered, some approaching Jacob to offer congratulations. He accepted them with humility, his thoughts already turning to the future. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged in a space that had seemed so insurmountable just days before. And as he stepped out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon light, Jacob Brooks knew this was only the beginning. The courthouse doors creaked open, and Jacob Brooks stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. For a moment, he paused at the top of the courthouse steps, taking in the scene before him. A small crowd had gathered, their expressions warm and welcoming. Among them were his parents, their faces glowing with pride, and a handful of classmates and teachers who had come to support him. But what struck Jacob most were the strangers, ordinary people who had no personal stake in the case but had followed it closely, inspired by his perseverance and courage. As soon as Jacob descended the first step, his mother rushed forward and enveloped him in a tight hug. "You were incredible, Jacob," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We always knew you had it in you, but seeing you stand up there, I've never been prouder." His father, usually reserved, clapped a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've done something remarkable today," he said, his tone steady but filled with admiration. "Not just for Mr. Harris, but for yourself." Jacob smiled, his nerves finally starting to ease. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. "I just wanted to do what was right." As they spoke, others began to approach. Mr. Harris, the farmer whose land Jacob had fought so hard to protect, stepped forward, his weathered face lined with gratitude. "Jacob," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did, it wasn't just about saving my land. You reminded me that there's still justice in this world. You gave me hope." Jacob shook his hand firmly. "You trusted me when no one else would," he said. "I couldn't let you down." Behind them, the crowd continued to grow. Strangers came up one by one, some shaking Jacob's hand, others simply offering kind words. "You've got guts, kid," an older man said, his tone gruff but approving. "Not many people would have stood their ground the way you did." "Thank you," Jacob replied, his voice steady but humble. "That means a lot." Amid the congratulations, a figure stepped out of the crowd that Jacob didn't expect to see. James Warren, one of the corporate attorneys he had faced in court. Gone was the smug, confident demeanor Warren had displayed during the trial. In its place was a quiet respect that caught Jacob off guard. "Mr. Brooks," Warren said, extending his hand, I have to admit, you surprised me. What you did in there, it was impressive. Most seasoned attorneys would have folded under the pressure you faced, but you held your own. Jacob hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. Thank you, Mr. Warren, he said. That means a lot coming from you. Warren nodded, then pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Jacob. I know you're still in high school, but if you're serious about pursuing law, give me a call after you graduate. We could use someone like you at our firm. Jacob stared at the card, momentarily speechless. Coming from the very attorney who had once dismissed him as a mere child, the offer felt surreal. But instead of letting it overwhelm him, Jacob simply nodded. I'll think about it, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As Warren walked away, Jacob's best friend Ryan bounded up the steps, clapping him on the back. Dude, did I just see what I think I saw? Ryan asked, grinning ear to ear. The guy who tried to crush you in court just offered you a job? Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I guess he did. Ryan let out a low whistle. Man, you're like a real-life courtroom legend now. Jacob rolled his eyes but couldn't help smiling. Let's not go that far. Despite his humility, the magnitude of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. Over the past few days, Jacob had faced condescension, ridicule, and outright dismissal, all because of his age. Yet he had proven, to the courtroom and to himself, that his voice mattered. He had stood firm against experienced lawyers, navigated a challenging case, and come out on the other side with not just a victory, but a newfound sense of purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, Jacob's mother placed a hand on his arm. You know, she said softly, this is just the beginning for you. Today, you showed everyone what you're capable of. Imagine what you'll achieve in the future. Jacob looked out at the horizon, the courthouse behind him, and the possibilities ahead. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of triumph. It was a foundation, a reminder that no matter the odds, no matter how underestimated he might be, he had the power to make a difference. With one final glance at the courthouse steps, Jacob turned to his family and friends. Let's go home, he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. As they walked away together, Jacob couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement for what lay ahead. This was just the beginning. The conference room of the Judicial Review Board was far less grand than the courtroom where Judge Henry Lowe had once presided, but it carried an atmosphere of severity that even he could not ignore. The walls were plain, the furniture functional, and the air heavy with judgment. Seated at the long table were 5 board members, 3 judges, a legal ethics professor, and a retired attorney, each with an expression that spoke of impartiality, scrutiny, and unspoken disappointment. Judge Lowe, a man who had spent decades on the bench, now sat alone at the far end of the room. His usual air of authority was gone, replaced by a quiet unease. His once impeccable posture was slightly slouched, and his hands rested awkwardly on the table, betraying a nervous energy. Before him lay a stack of papers, evidence of his alleged misconduct, and a microphone that recorded every word of the proceedings. Judge Lowe, began the chair of the board, a silver-haired woman with piercing eyes and a calm but firm tone. You have been called before this board to address allegations of ethical violations in your handling of recent cases, specifically regarding your connections to Clearview Holdings. Do you understand the gravity of these proceedings? Lowe nodded, his voice subdued. Yes, I do. Good, the chair continued. Let the record show that Judge Henry Lowe has acknowledged the proceedings and is present to respond to the charges. Let us proceed. The board wasted no time laying out the evidence. Over the next hour, the chair and other members systematically reviewed the allegations against Lowe, starting with his failure to disclose a financial connection between his family's charitable foundation and Clearview Holdings. They highlighted cases in which Lowe had ruled in favor of the corporation, noting a pattern of decisions that raised serious questions about his impartiality. "Judge Lowe," the chair said, fixing him with a sharp gaze, "can you explain why you did not disclose these connections, as required under the Code of Judicial Conduct?" Lowe cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "The foundation is run by my brother, not me," he began. "I had no direct involvement in its operations. And yet," the ethics professor on the board interjected, "you were aware of the substantial donations made by Clearview Holdings. Did you not consider how this might appear to the public or the parties involved in cases related to the corporation?" Lowe shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "In hindsight, I should have been more transparent," he admitted. "But I assure you, my rulings were based solely on the merits of each case." The retired attorney, a man with decades of experience in both prosecution and defense, leaned forward. "Even if that were true, Judge Lowe, perception matters. The judiciary must remain above reproach, and your failure to disclose these connections has cast doubt not only on your rulings, but on the integrity of the entire system." The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled. Lowe's face betrayed a flicker of resentment, but he quickly masked it, knowing that any sign of defiance would only worsen his situation. The proceedings continued, and the board did not relent. They brought up additional instances of questionable behavior: his dismissive treatment of young attorneys like Jacob Brooks, his apparent bias in favor of corporate interests, and his lack of decorum in the courtroom. Each point chipped away at the once unshakable image of Judge Henry Lowe, leaving a tarnished legacy in its place. By the time the board adjourned to deliberate, Lowe sat alone, his shoulders slumped. The silence in the room was deafening. For a man who had spent years commanding respect and wielding authority, the realization that his reputation was now in the hands of others was a bitter pill to swallow. Meanwhile, outside the walls of this somber hearing, Jacob Brooks' name was making waves. The story of the 17-year-old who had stood his ground against seasoned attorneys, and even a judge, had captured the public's imagination. News outlets ran headlines like, "Teen Attorney Exposes Judicial Corruption," and "David versus Goliath, How a High School Student Restored Justice." For many, Jacob's victory wasn't just about the specifics of the case. It was a symbol of what justice should be: fair, impartial, and accessible to all, regardless of age or status. His determination, resourcefulness, and unwavering commitment to fairness had resonated with people across the country, sparking conversations about the need for greater accountability in the legal system. In interviews, legal analysts praised Jacob's handling of the case, calling it a masterclass in preparation and integrity. "He's the kind of advocate the system needs," one prominent attorney remarked. "Someone who isn't afraid to challenge the status quo and fight for what's right, even when the odds are against him." Even in the courthouse where the trial had taken place, Jacob's impact was evident. Clerks, staff, and even opposing counsel found themselves reflecting on the lessons of the case. Judge Caldwell, who had taken over the trial after Lowe's recusal, spoke candidly about the young attorney's influence. "Jacob reminded us all of why we entered this profession: to uphold justice and protect those who can't protect themselves." Back at the review board, the deliberations concluded, and Judge Lowe was called back into the room. The chair delivered the board's decision with the same calm authority she had displayed throughout the proceedings. "Judge Lowe, this board finds that your actions constituted a serious violation of judicial ethics. Your failure to disclose financial connections to Clearview Holdings, coupled with your conduct in the courtroom, has undermined public confidence in the judiciary. As such, we recommend your immediate resignation from the bench and refer this matter for further disciplinary action." Lowe's face remained impassive, but his clenched jaw betrayed the humiliation he felt. He nodded stiffly, murmuring a quiet, "I understand," before rising to leave. His career, once marked by authority and respect, now ended in disgrace, a stark reminder of the consequences of abusing power. As word of the decision spread, it served as a powerful bookend to Jacob's triumph. Where Lowe's fall symbolized corruption's downfall, Jacob's rise became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the smallest voice could bring about meaningful change. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Jacob Brooks stood alone, taking in the moment. The courthouse, a building that had once felt so intimidating and overwhelming, now seemed less daunting. Its grand columns and towering facade, which had loomed over him just days ago, no longer felt like a symbol of insurmountable power. Instead, it stood as a reminder of what he had achieved inside its walls. Jacob adjusted his slightly oversized suit jacket, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The suit no longer felt like a poor fit. It felt like a part of his story. Each thread carried the memory of every challenge he had faced and every moment of doubt he had overcome. Today, he had proven to himself and to everyone watching that he belonged in this world, no matter how young or underestimated he might be. The courthouse steps, now nearly empty, were the same ones he had walked up just days ago with trembling hands and a racing heart. He remembered how every whispered comment, every sideways glance, had amplified his self-doubt. But he had kept walking, step by step, determined to prove that his age was not a limitation. And now, as he stood at the top of those steps looking outward, the world before him felt vast, filled with possibility. For Jacob, the case had been about more than just a legal battle. It was a test of his resilience, his courage, and his belief in doing what was right. He thought back to the moments when he had nearly faltered, when the judge's dismissive tone or the corporate attorney's condescension had made him question whether he could really make a difference. But he hadn't given up. Instead, he had leaned into the discomfort, drawing strength from his preparation and his conviction that justice was worth fighting for. The trial had been a whirlwind of emotions. There were moments of crushing doubt, like when his arguments were dismissed as naive or irrelevant, and moments of quiet triumph, like when he had uncovered the evidence that turned the case around. Each of those experiences had shaped him, solidifying a sense of purpose he hadn't fully realized before. He thought of Mr. Harris, the farmer whose land he had fought so hard to protect. Seeing the gratitude and relief on the man's face after the verdict had been a moment Jacob would never forget. It was the kind of victory that went beyond legal precedent. It was about restoring dignity and hope to someone who had nearly lost everything. That feeling of making a real difference, of standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, was something Jacob knew he wanted to carry forward. The quiet hum of the street below brought him back to the present. A few passers-by glanced up at him, their expressions curious but warm. Some recognized him from the trial. Others simply saw a young man standing tall, a look of quiet determination on his face. Jacob wondered how many of them had ever felt underestimated, how many had been told they didn't belong or weren't good enough. His story, he hoped, could serve as a reminder that those voices didn't have to define them. A breeze swept through, ruffling the papers in his hands. One of them was the business card James Warren, the opposing attorney, had handed him after the trial. Jacob had tucked it into his case file without much thought at the time, but now he pulled it out, holding it between his fingers. The gesture had been unexpected, a sign of respect from someone who had initially dismissed him as a child playing dress-up. It was proof of how far he had come in just a few days, not just in the eyes of others, but in his own. But more than the recognition, Jacob valued what the case had taught him about himself. He had learned that strength wasn't about never feeling afraid. It was about pushing forward despite the fear. He had learned that preparation and determination could level even the most uneven playing fields. And, most importantly, he had learned that the fight for justice was worth every sleepless night and every moment of doubt. As he looked out over the city, Jacob felt a deep sense of clarity. This trial was just the beginning. There would be other cases, other battles to fight, and he knew they wouldn't all end in applause or victory. But he also knew now, with unwavering certainty, that he had found his path. The law wasn't just a career choice for him, it was a calling, a way to channel his passion for fairness and equity into something meaningful. Behind him, the courthouse doors opened briefly, spilling out a few late stragglers. Their footsteps echoed faintly before fading into the city's background noise. Jacob didn't turn around. He didn't need to. His focus was ahead, on the future, on the possibilities that stretched out before him like an open road. The journey that had begun with hesitation and uncertainty now felt like a foundation. Jacob wasn't the same person who had walked into the courtroom on that first day. He was stronger, more confident, and more sure of who he was and what he stood for. And as he took a deep breath and stepped down from the courthouse steps, he carried with him the quiet but unshakable belief that even the underestimated could achieve greatness. With every step, the echoes of the past few days faded into memory, leaving only the lessons and the resolve they had forged. Jacob knew there were challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. The courthouse receded into the background as he walked forward, his head held high, his heart full of purpose. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away.